Macrosociology. In this lecture, we're going to talk about social interaction and social structure. So when we talk about social structure, we're looking at life from the macro-sociological perspective, which looks at large-scale features of social life. For instance, we could look at the American family or the family globally. We could look at education in the United States or education globally. And those would be macro, large-scale analyses. We could also look at the micro-sociological perspective. So in this chapter, we're talking about structure and interaction. So when we talk about interaction, we're looking at smaller micro variables. When we talk about macro-sociology, you will hear me refer to structural variables. Family, education, military, those are social institutions. I'll also talk about the type of society we live in. Society is a macro structural variable, whereas things like stereotypes, things like identity, that's micro sociology. So we'll dive right in. When we look at social structure, sociologists at the macro level see that structure guides our behavior. They could say that behavior is dictated by your location in social structure, so where you are in things like social class, things such as what status, position you occupy. We have already discussed culture. This is the language, values, beliefs, and norms that are passed from generation to generation. And in the chapter on socialization, we talked a little bit about how this happens. But in this chapter, we're talking about social structure, and culture specifically is one of these structural variables. Your life is directly impacted by where you are located in the culture, but also where you are located in social class. Think of social class as a group of people with similar levels of income, education, and occupational prestige. The macro sociological perspective also helps us look at status. So social status is a position that a person occupies. Ascribed status is a position that a person is born with. So for instance, your ascribed status at your time of birth would be son. It could be brother, sister, nephew. Also could be daughter, cousin. Those are titles that you are given at birth. They are ascribed to you. Now, based on your own individual choices, you will achieve different statuses. Now, these are negative or positive, either one. It simply, though, carries with it the idea that your actions will grant you position in society, whatever that may be. If you commit a felony and you are a convicted felon, your achieved status is convicted felon. If after your felony charge you go on to become an award-winning actor or recording artist, people still know you primarily for your felony conviction, then this is a master status. So the master status is that status that cuts across all other positions you hold. And a status set would be all of the statuses that you hold. Brother, employee, student, sister, mother, what have you. Now, statuses will differ from roles, in that roles are the expectations that come along with the status that you occupy. You would say you occupy a status, but play a role. So the status that I occupy is college instructor. So the role that I'm playing is giving lectures, grading tests. In this day, it is teaching online, uploading a lecture into our learning management system, Canvas. And so your roles change with different statuses. Now, when I get home this afternoon, I will be playing a different role, playing the role of father, husband, community leader, whichever different status I'm occupying in that moment. So with the look into social structure, we can look into culture, we can look at status, we also look at groups. So a group is people who you regularly and consciously interact with, and also people that you think of yourself as belonging to. Whereas a category would designate people that you have something in common with. A group is different in that these are individuals that we routinely and regularly interact with. Now, in terms of social institutions, this is another structural variable that macro level sociologists are looking at. Social institutions are the means developed by which societies meet basic needs. So for instance, we have the basic need of healthcare, and therefore our healthcare system is a very large social institution. The more industrialized the society, the more formal the institution. So for instance, if we were looking at medicine in a primitive and indigenous culture, they may have folk remedies, they may have a medicine man, or they may, moving forward into agricultural society in the 1600s in the US, we had doctors making house calls, and the more formal, the more industrialized our society became, the more formal the medical healthcare system became as well. You're going to see this with education. You're going to see this with any social institution, even religion. Religion becomes far more bureaucratized and formal as society becomes more industrialized. Another structural variable is society. When we talk about society, we are talking about the way people group obtain their food, and it also speaks to what sort of work they engage in. And the most basic society is the hunting and gathering society. There are few social divisions, little inequality in terms of there's really no difference between haves and have-nots. They all basically have the same stuff and they live communally. Only about 300 hunting and gathering groups exist today. Native Americans were hunter-gatherers, and the Aborigines in Australia are well-known hunter-gatherers. Then when society develops certain technologies, inevitably there is a movement from one society to the other. With the technology of horticultural advances, where this one enabled people to herd animals as well as to reproduce crops. This led the way to pastoral and horticultural societies. This was an advantage in that people didn't have to keep moving to follow the herds of buffalo, or as nomadic people typically may exhaust the resources of a certain area as their population grows. Being a pastoral or horticultural society enables a group of people to remain in one location. So if you depend on pasturing of animals and you're shepherds, well then perhaps the young men will shepherd your flocks and the majority of your population can remain fixed in one area. This gave way to the invention of the plow, and using beasts of burden to break up soil. This led to a surplus. This is what some have referred to as the dawn of civilization. And at this point, you can see greater surplus, some people developing more than others. In 1776, there was another technological advance. This was the use of locomotive steam engine. That was developed in 1776, but the technology was then applied to all industry. Factories eventually would lead to the development of the assembly line by Henry Ford in America, and then the things just continued to go from 1776 in Great Britain to really modernity as we know it. People flock to cities, and we see great concentration of wealth in the urban areas. This led to post-industrial societies where we now are, and the key technology here was in 1965, development of the microchip. The development of the microchip, which led to the personal computer, was actually developed in an effort to land America on the moon. So in the space race, the microchip was a necessary ingredient to make the space travel lighter, basically, if we could reduce the weight of the circuitry. And by doing this, technology would eventually allow for the personal computer in the 80s, the internet in the 90s, the cell phone in late 90s, and then you think of the iPhone, which would really lead way to a mobile wave, a mobile society. Sociologists throughout the years have argued and debated as to what holds society together. These are macro level discussions. Emil Durkheim said that early on people were connected by mechanical solidarity, meaning everyone did the same job, therefore they had a shared identity. This gave way to organic solidarity, which is present today. This is a communal interdependence. So I don't really fix stuff at the house. I'm not mechanically inclined. I'm not a carpenter. I'm not a plumber. I'm a teacher. And I'm also a pastor. So I stay in my lane and we hire those jobs out. The individual who comes to fix my plumbing might send their child when they graduate high school to Colin, and they may take my class. And so not everybody in society does everything, but in a mechanical solidarity, it looks very much like the Amish live today. So the Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, still live in a very mechanical solidarity type of context where all the men know carpentry and do carpentry, all the men know farming and do farming, all the women know how to cook and clean and sew, and gender roles are divided accordingly. Tony's had similar concepts. Gemeinschaft is a close-knit personal society that once existed, and he theorized that this gave way to Gesellschaft, an impersonal society. And so mechanical solidarity is to Gemeinschaft what organic solidarity is to Gesellschaft. And this is simply the idea is that the more different roles there are in society, the more impersonal it can be. Now, as we move to micro-sociology, the micro-sociological perspective, we're looking at social interaction in everyday life. And one micro variable that we always begin with is a stereotype. Now, you are aware of stereotypes, and I ask my students if they've ever stereotyped someone. Sometimes people do, sometimes people do not raise their hands, but we all have done this because it is kind of human nature. When you look at what a stereotype is, it's an assumption about the characteristics of a certain individual, which leads to generalizations about that individual. So you're sitting in class getting ready for it to start, first day, someone comes in the door, you see them based on a few variables. You then begin to make assumptions about them. So we see features of the person or hear things about the person. We fit what we see or hear into stereotypes and then expect the person to act in that certain way. And how we expect a person to act or shape, how we expect this person to act shapes our attitudes about the person. And this is where it gets really interesting. And this is where some would say maybe controversial. Now, based on how we act towards the person, that individual gets an idea of how we perceive them. And this can in turn impact a person's self-concept. So for instance, if I'm looking for a person to act in a certain way because I expect them to, they can then be influenced by that action in what Robert Merton called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Personal space, Edward Hall said that there's an invisible bubble by which we surround ourselves. In America, he found that Americans preferred a public space when they're out and open with people they don't know, so they prefer this safe zone of 8 to 10 feet just in face-to-face with someone they don't know. The social space would be 5 to 6. Personal space would be 3 feet. That's conversational space. An intimate space is within 18 inches, and that's reserved only for family or very close friends. Perhaps if we're giving someone that we know a hug. And what has happened in this era of social distancing is that everything has been backed away 6 feet. So now there's only one distance, and that is social distance. And on college campuses, there are professors that are asking students what this is like to wear a mask and to remain distant. And online, people are talking. And the sense that I get is that people feel disconnected without being able to see somebody's face. Then this really circumvents a lot of our social interaction. We really depend on that feedback. We depend on that data. And this can be difficult for people, and it is difficult for folks. Irving Goffman said that life is like a play, and he called this dramaturgy or dramaturgical analysis. And so really what happens is you go into your work week, you go into your classes or work, go into your relationships, and you're playing a part. Life is like a role you have been assigned, and you are playing that. And from time to time, you break character. You may slip and do something embarrassing, or say something you're not supposed to say, and what happens inevitably is people around you help you save face. They help you stay in character. Goffman talked about the difference between front stage, and backstage. Your front stage is being professional, acting in accordance with social norms. And backstage is what happens when you're at your house, when no one is around. So, if the things that happen sort of, whether you're getting ready for work or aren't things designed for other people to see. In fact, that's out of character. We don't really want to know about, personal hygiene habits, and to sort of bring that in and discuss those things is violation of our code, right? We help other people stay in their lane and stay in their character. So according to the dramaturgical analysis, role conflict happens between two separate roles. So I'm playing a role of a teacher, and on Sundays and Wednesdays I play the role of a pastor. And the more roles you play, the more conflict that you experience. And so if I have in the past, I've had students that know me from one context and they come into another and vice versa. And this is inevitably difficult for people that are occupying kind of contradictory space locations. We all do. You know, your role as a mom or a dad or a sister or a brother can conflict with that of a student. I've had students so many times in class, they get a call and they're trying not to look at their phone, but they say, I got to step out, this is mama. You know, at that moment, taking a call from mama then can be something of a conflict, right? You step out of student role and step into daughter role. Now, role strain happens when you're in one role and there's just ordinary difficulty in the role you're playing, right? So perhaps you want to answer the question so the teacher thinks well of you, but you don't want to answer too many questions so your classmates don't think that you're too snobbish or you're trying to be a goody-goody. You know, these are all things that we can wrestle with at times. So role strain for me would be, I want to be the teacher that students like, so they take my class, right? They can choose class, and I want to be well liked, but I also don't want to be a pushover and let students break the rules and the rules that the college has designated, turning stuff in on time. I mean, so there is this strain that we experience in any role. And it's interesting that the role strain and role conflict affect how you play the role, as well as what happens when you make mistakes and break character. Here's just an example. The role of son, daughter, friend, student, worker competes with one another, and with role strain, competing within one role. And you think of, it's complicated. People are in stress all the time because with each of these roles, you may have conflict and strain going on. Ethnomethodology is another micro level variable. It's another way of looking at life. Harold Garfinkel came up with an ingenious way. His theory was to study how people used background assumptions to get through everyday life. And he came up with a wonderful, ingenious way of figuring this out. He just directed his students to go into society and to break norms. So something as simple as wearing a mask would be a breaching experiment. And so, in some contexts, not wearing a mask is inciting confrontation, and also in the opposite. Sometimes wearing a mask is inciting confrontation. And in the Garfinkel experiments, he would ask students to violate people's personal space. Or he would say, walk into an elevator and stand 18 inches next to someone. Or if you go into a library, someone is sitting by themselves at a library table, sit directly next to them. And these things really feel bizarre when you're doing them, just as wearing a mask might, or keeping a 6-foot distance might. But these things, as we do them and they're different, that provides feedback. Right? The reason why it feels different to wear masks is because we're socialized to depend on facial cues. And we really get information. We don't really know how to act sometimes. So the ethnomethodological perspective is really fascinating. Gives way to the Thomas theorem. Two sociologists, Thomas and Thomas, said that our behavior depends not on the objective reality, but on the subjective interpretation of it. So if I believe something to be true, I act as if it is true. We behave according to the way we perceive the world. And so the sociological perspective just says, when I study someone or when I'm interacting with someone, it might be a good idea to think for a second of how they view the world and then act accordingly. Just for the point of understanding. So with that, we conclude this chapter. I look forward to hearing what you have to say in the discussion board. All right, take care.